So, this devlog was supposed to come out by the end of the first weekend of March, but then a number of things happened. I got sick, work picked up, and I somehow got caught up in a battle against existential dread caused by the loneliness I've struggled to fight off by keeping myself distracted in my downtime. But now that I'm feeling well enough to work on Rogue PROXI, let's see what my timeline looks like. Computer, how is my pace going for this project? I guess it's a good thing I'm not calling Rogue PROXI my dream game. Let me put it to you this way. Back in Devlog 0, I said that we have a pre-alpha prototype where the player can explore the randomized dungeons with grid-based movement. In this devlog, I will talk about how we got this prototype to work in its current state. Even with a Git repository like this, it's a bit of a long story. To start, the original plan was to use Dungeon Architect, as it was well regarded, very powerful, and I already happen to have the tool from some sort of Humble bundle, though for the life of me I can't remember which bundle that was. The thing with Dungeon Architect is that even if you ignore all the sample assets that came with it, it's a large and complicated tool to work with, so reading through the tutorials to try and understand how it all works was a gargantuan task. And after spending so many weeks on the tutorials and documentation, I was not able to get it to work. At all. Eventually, I started looking for alternatives, which led me to Dungeon, which was much easier to set up and ultimately easier to use. No disrespect to anyone who uses Dungeon Architect, but Dungeon was simply a better tool for my needs. That is not to say that Dungeon can magically do everything on its own. The original plan was to use a number of basic grid tiles I made in Blender and have Dungeon place them in accordance to where the generated path was supposed to go. However, it turned out that all I needed was just the crossroads tile and a wall to make it work. Of course, I could put in a door, but for the sake of the prototype, we are not interested in putting in rooms yet. We just wanted to make random corridors. With that, we have our dungeon, but a dungeon is not a dungeon if you can't explore the dungeon. Now, is it? In order to get the player moving through the dungeon, the player has to be able to, well, move. This is where Grid Controller comes in. Typically, when you import a tool into Unity, you have to be careful that it doesn't conflict with any other tools you've imported into your project. Thankfully, I was able to get it working out of the box, more or less. The only rough spot I've experienced was in trying to get it set up with the new Unity input system. Seriously, Unity, why isn't it standard already? And once the input system was set up, everything was hunky-dory. Okay, maybe not hunky-dory right off the bat. You see, one of the most important skills you can learn in software development is the ability to read documentation. Or, to put it in layman's terms, have you tried reading the manual? As it turned out, the reason why the player could walk through walls is because the player and walls didn't have any collider set up. So all I had to do was to put on a capsule collider around the player and a cube collider around the wall. Then I'm good to go. Oh, what is it now? It turned out that I had to adjust the size of the collider so that the player can move around freely instead of being trapped in the starting tile. With that, there we go! Now we can walk around and bump into walls as much as we want, just like in Persona 1. Now, it's not enough to set up Grid Controller and call it a day. As easy as Grid Controller is to set up, the way the movement lerps is not the kind of movement I want to emulate. It feels a little too smooth and modern for what we're going for. The nice thing is that Grid Controller has the option to give players the feeling they're playing old-school dungeon crawlers by using snap movement. But the problem is that the movement is too old-school. It's kind of funny, isn't it? The kind of movement I want to emulate is somewhere between the two extremes where it snaps to each step you take in turn, but it still feels like you're moving. For lack of a better term, I'm going to call this rigid movement. The beauty about bringing in tools and assets from the Unity Asset Store is that you don't have to use everything just as they are. In fact, it is generally encouraged to make the asset or tool your own. And the nice thing about Grid Controller is that I have access to the C# code, which makes it easy to modify for my needs. In this case, I wanted to create the option for rigid movement, which would appear in the inspector as a simple Boolean checkmark. Next would be to modify how the player turns, walks, and bumps into walls. My strategy for turning was basically to divide the entire 90-degree angle into an array of different sectioned angles to make within the turn time. The advantage of this approach is that I can control how many sections I want the player to turn, from tier to, I don't know, 100. I chose 3 because it seems to be the most reasonable number of angles for the style I want to go for. The only pain in the rear with coding this was that going from one direction to another was unpredictable. As much as I was able to fix the code to allow for turning in all directions, turning from north to west and vice versa ended up being the greatest pain in the rear of all. But thank goodness if statements are easy to abuse. After all, if it works, it works. Walking was simply a matter of making the player move in an array of 2 positions. The first being halfway in between the initial position and the final position itself. I know no one is asking this, but why just 2 steps? Why not 3, 4, or 1,000 steps? Yeah, I have experimented with allowing for more than 2 steps, but not only was that disastrous, it was ultimately unnecessary. 2 steps is just fine for rigid movement. Lastly was bumping into walls. The interesting thing about Grid Controller is that bumping into walls is a thing for smooth movement only. Snap movement apparently doesn't allow it. For rigid movement, it was more or less the same logic as smooth movement, except instead of quickly lerping to the wall and back, I simply snapped the player to the bump position for a short amount of time before snapping the player position back to where the player was before. All in all, writing the code to make rigid movement took a fair amount of work, but I think it was well worth it. If you've read Matthew's post about designing the UI, you probably would have seen screenshots of what exploration would look like in the Shin Megami Tensei series. And obviously, we don't want the whole screen to be taken up just to show where the player is going. Just this small portion. But how would we be able to do that? Unity doesn't look like it would allow for this kind of UI, except there is always a workaround. Did you note that a number of games that make use of mini-maps actually use a second camera and capture that view to apply on a render texture? Well, PROXI certainly did. I followed his tutorial for getting the player's camera to capture and display its view on a giant render texture to achieve this result. Oh, Brackies, we all miss you so much. Of course, we can't just have the render texture just float in a black void with words saying that there's no camera on the screen. I put in a second camera that's pointed down towards the black void below the generated dungeon to get rid of that warning. After that, I simply slapped on Matthew's UI mockup so that we have something to look at. I mean, it's not pretty, but it is the UI equivalent of writing on a blank page so that at least there's something written down. Of course, he will be refining the UI design as development progresses. To sum it up, even though I was not as productive as I wanted to be for the first 2 months, I have made some headway into implementing basic features. Not everything has been implemented as we wanted though. We still have to ensure that the dungeon layout is randomized when the scene starts up, the UI has yet to be hooked up with something functional, and the placeholder text will need to be replaced with an actual font that is, well, readable. As it is, I'm happy with the progress I've made, all things considering, and I hope that I will be just as productive by the time the next devlog rolls around, assuming it doesn't take more than 1 month to get there. With all that being said, I shall leave you with this. Good night, dear viewer. May you dream among the stars in the nebula.